Seven Blue Skies channel brings you a new Dr. Rifat Ismail adventure in Paranormal, Book 1.5, Legend of the Werewolf. Introduction. Once again, allow me to introduce myself. I am Dr. Rifat Ismail, retired professor of hematology in the University of and a fair number of universities in Europe and the United States. My age is around 70, and I'm single because my busy life left me no chance to be like others. I have seen a lot of things. I opened the coffin of Count Dracula. I fought the werewolf in Romania. I searched for Loch Ness Monster in Scotland. I met the abominable snowman in Tibet. I answered the call of the demon caller in the dark cornfields of Egypt, and I encountered the zombies in Jamaica. All of this I will tell you in this series of books, but once again, I advise those with weak nerves and sensitive natures not to read, so as to save themselves hours of tension, panic, and fear of the dark. Today, I will tell you my story of the werewolf. 1. Country of Legends. Esteban looked beyond the lit candle at the faces of those sitting around him and whispered, "Guys, the werewolf is someone sitting at this table." Before we reach that part, let's rewind a few days back to my visit to Romania for the first time in my life. I was 37 years old then, and it had been 2 years since my terrible encounter with Count Dracula. Perhaps misguided as usual, I had thought my problems had ended forever and that the time had come to marry, begin a small family, and open a clinic as soon as I returned from this scientific mission. In one of the universities in Cluj, I met a Romanian journalist named Gustav Niculescu. He was a very smart man with a good sense of humor. He spoke English fluently and had a good fund of knowledge in literature and the humanities. He considered himself my guide all along the way, and he taught me a lot about Romania, a country about which I knew next to nothing. "What's the main religion here?" I asked. "Christian Orthodox," he replied. "The majority of the population is Romanian Orthodox." "And communism?" He smiled sarcastically and mumbled while giving me a meaningful look. "Communism will not change Romania, comrade. Romania is cut from a unique cloth in Europe, and it will never change. I've been told the word Romania means the land of Rome. The Roman Emperor Trajan had conquered the land and expelled the barbarians in Dacia in the year 106 AD, and so it became a Roman state. Next it was occupied by the Goths, and after them the Slavs in the 6th century. I think it was the Slavs who gave Romania its unique character," I suggested. "We'll come to them," he said. "To a certain extent, the important thing is that they divided it into 2 areas, Transylvania and Wallachia." Transylvania? Where the palace of Count Dracula," said Gustav. "Yes, it's a country notorious for legends, its most famous tourist attraction being the palace of Count Dracula. We must visit it together. It's a very inspiring place." "What a fool you are. What do you know about that palace, the coffin of the Count, and his servant, and about—" "Actually, the Castle of Frankenstein is also located in Transylvania, as described by Mary Shelley." "What a beautiful country!" I exclaimed. "Anyway," he went on, "I was saying that the Turks invaded Romania. A huge battle took place between the Russian and Ottoman empires, ending with the Treaty of San Stefano. Then the sick man of Europe, Turkey, ceded parts of the country to Austria." "Well, when did Romania gain unification?" I asked. "That happened in 1856, when Prince Alexander Cuza was elected to rule. And after World War I, Romania annexed Bukovina from Ukraine. And with World War II, General Antonescu came to power as a Nazi ally, which resulted in our losing Bukovina once again and ceding parts of Transylvania to Hungary. And after World War II," he went on, "we became a communist country in the year 1961, and none of us could anticipate what would become of Romania, and communism altogether, some 30 years later." "Well, why do you favor communism?" I asked. "Your comrade is forced, not a hero," he replied. "Moscow does not allow the choice. In addition, we sought any change after the injustice of the previous era. May I light my cigarette using yours? I offered him my cigarette, which he took while saying, Imagine, before the year 1947, we would both be sentenced to prison for this crime. Which crime? Lighting one cigarette from another, he answered simply. The state monopoly forced citizens to use matches for that purpose, to promote the matches industry. This idea really made me laugh. I never would have imagined such a clever way of strangling personal freedoms. What human ignorance. Gustav told me, You'll see loads of wonders in Romania. But now you should go to your hotel and take some rest. I'll see you tomorrow. In the following 2 weeks, we went on an amazing tour. We visited universities in Cluj and the ancient churches in Bucharest. We checked out pubs on the Black Sea, where strong sailors regaled us with thrilling tales. We visited Constanta, the foremost Romanian port. But what affected me most was my visit to Transylvania. Gustav was saying, Transylvania is situated in the west delta of the country, bordered by a chain of the Transylvanian Alps. And to the north, you'll find the steel-producing hubs and the Carpathian region. That name seems familiar, I commented. Carpathia is a grassy valley bordered by moderately high mountains and the Danube River to the south. The blue? Well, he replied, there's no red Danube as far as I know. And that night we visited Count Dracula's decrepit palace. I remembered its details from prior photos. I shivered while remembering Dr. Richard and Luvereski sneaking into the palace at night to search for Dracula's mummy. And I recalled how the local villagers suffered much fright while passing nearby. But this place pulsed with an indescribable otherworldliness. Romanian folklore, Gustav said, is filled with horror stories. Romanian mothers scare their children with stories of vampires and werewolves and Nosferatu. But why in Romania specifically? I asked. It's either because of the local strong imaginations, or because such mutants actually did exist in Romania. Gustav's car battled the rough road as rain fell heavily and our breaths condensed on the warm windshield. I cleared it with my handkerchief intermittently. And in the distance, above the dense and dark jungles, a tongue of lightning split the sky, lighting up all existence with an electric blue and then disappearing. A few moments later, the thunder struck as if the stars above were colliding. It's the cravat, Gustav remarked. Cravat? Yes, a strong wintry wind which blows through this area, causing disaster in the fields. The farmers here really have a tough time. A bad omen, I murmured. Don't be morbid, comrade. You've only seen the smiling Romania. Wait until you see it show its fangs. We were passing through the Danube Delta in the south of the country. All of the birds had taken refuge from the storm, and all that remained were the vast forest filled with wolves looking for shelter. The snow fell softly but effectively. In moments, the forests became pristine white. I had never seen snow in my life. I felt like I was dreaming. Suddenly, the scene had transformed into a stage for a fairy tale. It's true, human imagination comes alive in these frozen places. It must. Amazing, I exclaimed. You mean you've never seen snow before? I haven't. But didn't you say you had visited England and France several times? Yes, I answered, but it was always in clear weather, sadly. Breaking into laughter, he lit up a cigarette and said, The Danube Delta is filled with geese, bears, and panthers. Panthers? Of course. You haven't really seen Romania yet, my friend, but it seems like you're about to see a lot more of it. What do you mean? I mean, he explained, that we can't continue in this weather without chains on the tires. We have to stop. Gustav checked the map and said, The nearest city is Torshavn, but it's still rather far. But there is a small village called Krabaveska about 10 minutes from here. I think it's our only hope. but we have to move quickly before the situation gets worse." I agreed quickly as, coming from the Nile Valley, my hot blood was freezing in my veins. I wore 2 pullovers and a coat, and underneath my pants, the thick cotton long johns given to me by my mother upon my first ever trip to Alexandria. But in spite of that, I was freezing, my nose was running, and I realized I was in very bad shape. After placing the map back in the glove compartment, Gustav turned the engine a few times. I held my breath, not wanting to think what would happen if the car refused to start. But the car moved forward. We went silent, nothing around us except for the snow-covered trees glistening in the headlights. In the distance, a wolf or two ran across the road. "Gustav? What about frostbite?" For those who don't know, frostbite is a form of gangrene which affects the limbs in severe cold, leading to amputation. He replied, "God forbid." "I'm not joking. I can't feel my toes." "Well, anyway," said Gustav, "we're not in Siberia, so don't be such a baby." I said nothing but cursed him internally. I also cursed this Danube Delta and the cravat, or whatever it's called, imagining myself going back to Cairo without legs, forced to become a beggar in front of Hussein Mosque, and imagining myself a victim of the white Romanian wolves, which were no joke. Would they memorialize me in the medical school, naming a restroom after me? The restroom of the martyr, Rifat Ismail. At that time, I had no idea I would still be alive after another 30 years. But today I realize that after every ordeal in my life, and how many there were, I always thought it was the last. And that's why I didn't enjoy my trips, and never learned. When you enter a haunted house or amusement park in a horror movie, you totally expect that whatever happens, you'll make it home alive after all the horror. And so you live the experience fully. As for me, I didn't know. And after long years, the lesson I have learned is that by assuming I would get out of every ordeal alive, I can remain calm and clear-headed. Panicking doesn't help, and death is an appointment already set, which nothing will change, neither my worrying nor fright. So when it comes, let me die a smiling, confident man. But I didn't understand that back then. In the distance, the lights of the village appeared. It was 10 p.m. The snow-covered streets. The heavy darkness except for some dim lights behind closed windows. Imagining the families around the fireplace, I trembled, thinking of the coziness. And the food. Now, we must find a warm tavern. Pulling up to a wooden sign lit by a lantern, Gustav got out of the car and knocked loudly at the door, shouting something in Romanian. Someone inside responded in Romanian in a cruel tone. When you hear a language you don't understand, it seems that all the words run so quickly on the speaker's tongue, at a speed you can't follow. Gustav shouted again, and the voice inside shouted back. What's going on? He returned to the car cursing with what I assumed were very profane Romanian swears. Opening the car door, he sat next to me, exclaiming, "That pig! He won't open to us." "Why not?" I asked. "I don't know. He said I can report him to the tourist authority or to the Communist Party itself, but he won't open." "Maybe he thought we were thieves?" No, he replied. "The Danube shepherds are usually very friendly, but this guy, I don't get it." He started the engine, and we traversed the snow-covered streets in silence. After a few minutes, I asked, "Gustav?" "Yeah?" "Is tonight a religious holiday here?" "I don't think so, but why?" "Every single house in this village," I said, "has an iron cross on its door. Haven't you noticed that?" 3. The church. We reached an old church in the village, our last hope of staying the night. Gustav left the car, went to the rusty iron door, and clapped his hands together. He did not neglect to point out the iron cross planted in the snow in front of the door. He gave me a look meaning, "You were right." After a few minutes, a lantern appeared as the rusty door opened cautiously, revealing a face filled with wrinkles. It was the priest, white-bearded, with kind eyes and thick glasses. He reminded me of the Orthodox Romanians I had met in Alexandria. Gustav spoke a few short words to him, and the old priest shook his head in doubt but invited us in. Closing the car door behind me, I quickly jumped inside the church, shaking from the cold. We ascended rickety stairs to a sitting room with a large fireplace, the dear red flames so welcoming to us. Next to the fireplace, an old lady sat knitting wool. The priest introduced her to us with words I could not understand. Gustav translated. The lady is Father Antonescu's sister. On a wooden table, some prayer books were stacked along with two candle holders and a few religious icons. It was an old room, but comfortable and clean, and warm. We sat by the fire, feeling the flames warming our bones to the point of melting the marrow inside. Father Antonescu stood and poured liquid from a small bottle into 2 cups and presented them to Gustav and me. I looked at Gustav questioningly, and he said, "Hot rum to warm you up." With apology, I refused and returned the cup to him to drink instead, and Gustav explained to the priest, saying, "Muslim." Though he spoke in Romanian, he pronounced it just like we do in Arabic. The priest regarded me kindly, murmuring, "Aha, Muslim?" And a short conversation took place, the meaning of which I understood this time. Where was I from? And how did I get here? And why had I come to this bleak corner of the world in this freezing weather when my own country is one of the sweetest and warmest countries on the planet? If I knew how to speak Romanian, I would have told him, "I'm crazy, kind man, crazy, a lunatic looking for my demise." The old priest brought fragrant, steaming bowls of soup, 2 long loaves of bread, and a plate filled with sliced meat. He pointed at the meat and then at me, saying something which needed no translation for me to understand the meaning. But Gustav said, "He's telling you that this meat, Rifat, is veal," I interjected, "and not pork, right?" "How did you know?" His way of pointing and gesturing, and the expression in his eyes, it's international, my friend. If you had seen a movie in the Bengalese language, you would understand 80% of the story without much effort. We sat at the table, tasting the soup first. I had no idea what it was, but after tasting it, I had the notion it was shoe soup. Weird things swam within it, but it was hot, and that's what mattered. Gustav and the priest held a conversation about which I could understand nothing, loads of sh and ch sounds falling on my ears, practically rattling the table. Is the Romanian language really so rough-sounding? Behind his glasses, the priest's eyes widened as he seemed to stress these letters as Gustav regarded him in doubt. But he had stopped chewing, which made me think something had really aroused his interest. The priest made the sign of the cross several times. "What are you talking about, Gustav?" He looked at me sarcastically and said, "Guess. Aren't you an expert in the Bengalese language? The pointing and gesturing, my friend, remember?" "Okay, very funny. The father seems to believe in and fear something tremendously, but you don't believe him, though his words are starting to affect you." "Okay, you're right," Gustav admitted. "And to be more specific," I went on, "he's telling you that the devil, or evil spirit or something, is roaming this village tonight. That's why the villagers closed their doors and placed crosses over them. And he's asking God to protect us tonight." He looked at me doubtfully, saying, "You said you don't speak any Romanian." "Indeed," I replied. "But like I said, it's the pointing and gesturing. Plus, that's how the story always goes. I've learned that from reading Edgar Allan Poe." Gustav asked me, "And did you also realize from the gesturing that he had mangled 2 men last night?" "Who is he?" "Velasco, the werewolf," he replied. "In other words, a wolf who used to be a man." 4. Terror in the village. Surprised, I asked, "Do you mean a man who turns into a wolf at the sight of the full moon?" Gloating as he had finally managed to arouse my curiosity, Gustav explained. This legend originates here in Romania, and to be more specific, on the shores of the Danube. And to be even more specific, geographically, it seems that it originates in this village, unfortunately. He then took a spoonful of soup and gestured for me to continue eating. But what I had already eaten had turned into a brick in my stomach. Another myth follows me in this corner of the world, as if I'm the only one suitable for this dirty work. But the moon was crescent last night, I commented, and according to the legend, calm and peace return the night after the moon is full, and the werewolf transforms back into a human. Gustav exchanged some words with Father Antonescu and then turned to me, saying, 3 days. So, I guessed, the werewolf wreaks havoc in the village for 3 days? That's a long time. So tonight is the last night of the moon cycle? I guess so, said Gustav. I went back to my soup as Gustav and the priest continued their conversation. Then Gustav turned to me, saying, I told him you don't believe a word of this. Gustav, that's not right. I keep my opinions to myself. And he has invited you to visit the tavern, to hear what the men there have to say. But, I said, please apologize to him for me. I didn't mean to. Gustav went back to his conversation with the priest, and I overheard the word Nosferatu several times. The priest aimed at me, laughing, and Gustav explained. He's asking about your encounter with Count Dracula. I gave him a spiteful look, but said, well, I lived that story in a horrible way, but up until now I'm not sure of anything. The whole story may just be a series of illusions, or maybe a cruel joke I drank to the point of drunkenness. But I know one thing. I found no physical proof that the vampire had lived or is living in this world, and that my opinion does not and will not change. Everything that can't be seen, heard, smelled, or logicalized simply does not exist. That's my opinion on the legend of Dracula. Nosferatu, Gustav corrected me. They prefer this name here, and in Poland and Hungary. They're right, I said. It seems more endearing. The two men continued talking for 10 minutes, and then Gustav turned to me, saying, Father Antonescu says you're wrong. How amazing is this language? It may take me 2 hours just to tell the priest good night. I yawned, and the priest motioned to the lady, who stood immediately, carrying the kerosene lantern, and led us slowly to a small room with 2 clean beds. She said something, obviously good night in Romanian, and we threw ourselves on the beds in our clothes, as our bags were still in the car and neither of us was prepared to face the cold and dark to get some comfortable pajamas. I sunk into a deep sleep. The howling of the wolf in this village is so strange. A strong, throaty, pained voice, like a human suffering in the depths of hell. The howling woke me up 3 times in the middle of the night, so I would recite some verses from Quran and go back to sleep, dreaming of that miserable wolf hunting its prey in the dark and the snow. In the morning, Gustav and I went walking in the village. First, we had to find chains for the tires in order to continue our trip. And secondly, we wanted to visit the tavern as the priest had suggested, where we might find something that interests you, or me. At the mechanic's shop, Gustav approached a fat man covered in oil and sweat and shouting. My friend spoke to the man, who went on shouting. And as he came back, I smiled and said, Everyone in this village shouts and refuses your requests. This is no joke, said Gustav. He's saying that the cravat has blocked all the passes with snow, and that the only phone line is down, so they can't call the snow plows. Which means? Yes, exactly. We're trapped in this village until the snow melts. At the pub, Gustav ordered some rum for himself and coffee for me. We sat in the midst of a sea of thick Slovenian mustaches and looks of doubt. Around us sat muscular men wearing fur, which only added to their size, practically all of them armed with old rifles. All of these men are shepherds. They have a very tough life. And here they find themselves sitting near two delicate men like you and me, Gustav said, this while sipping from his cup, as I shrunk in my seat in this unwelcoming atmosphere. The bartender came close to us, so Gustav took out a bunch of lei, the Romanian currency, and placed it in the man's hand while saying something. At that moment, all the men started cheering happily and continued drinking rum. It's that old trick. Everyone's tab is on me. And so all hatred evaporated and all human barriers disappeared in seconds. A strong-built man drew close to us and pulled up a chair at our table. He shook Gustav's hand and my own with a hand which practically broke our fingers. He announced, Esteban Hrgovic, Gustav Niculescu, Rifat Ismail. Gustav asked him something in Romanian, and the man thought for a moment and then started telling a terrible, long story while sobbing intermittently. He then broke, and Gustav placed his hand on the man's shoulder and told me, he lost a friend the day before yesterday. His friend forgot to close the sheep barn, so he left his wife and kids, going out in the dark. A few seconds, but it was enough. His wife heard a terrible scream, and when she went out, armed, to see what had happened, she found her husband mangled on the ground, and next to him, the footprints of a wolf. And the other victim? I asked. Constantine was the village idiot. And did something happen last night? Nothing as far as we know. We were the most likely to be elected for that honor if that priest had not taken us in. Annoyed, I exclaimed, so those cowards would not open their doors for us and left us to be guaranteed meal for this comrade Belasco? Very smart. Gustav spoke to the shepherd again and then turned to me, saying, he says no one would open their door to us because the werewolf can speak in a human voice at times, very convincingly. And it's his opinion that Father Antonescu really wronged himself and his sister by opening the door for us and allowing us to stay the night. How sweet of him, I mumbled. I finished my coffee and asked Gustav, ask him who this werewolf is. Do they know him? He says that if they knew him, they would kill him. But it's one of them, of course. They have killed a lot of werewolves before. What? Are there a lot of them? Of course, Gustav replied. There's always one. The myth says that the one the werewolf wounds turns into a new werewolf the next month, as if it's an epidemic. So, you see, if you kill the first one, the second one is still out there. And then when they kill him, he would have already made a third one for the world. And so on. A long chain like this since medieval times until Judgment Day. Well, how do they kill a werewolf? It requires stabbing in the heart with a silver blade while he's in human form, because as a wolf, he's in the strongest state. He can easily rip a tree out by its roots. Well, how do they know he's the one while in the human state? I asked. Their conversation continued, and Esteban gestured to a disheveled bald man who came over. Esteban asked him for something, and the man took a scroll out of his jacket and threw it on the table, looking at me doubtfully. Esteban says that everyone in this village knows that if he is attacked by the werewolf, he has to try to injure it, so that if it survives, afterwards we can search for the one with the injury, who gets executed with a silver blade. And the scroll? I prompted. This man's name is Edu. He was attacked by a werewolf last month in the forest. He managed to pull off one of the claws before escaping. But in the morning, instead of the claw, he found something else in his pocket. Like some chocolates, for example? Esteban slowly opened the scroll, and inside was a frozen finger. A human finger wearing a ring with a blue gemstone. So, said Gustav, it didn't take a lot of effort for Edu to find out who in this village had lost a finger. He didn't even have to leave home. This ring belongs to his wife. 5. Katarina. Oh my God, I exclaimed. That's what they say, said Gustav. I don't believe it, but their story seems real. With annoyance, I said, and of course he killed his wife with a silver blade. Of course. And just like that, I went on, any butcher can kill his wife, cut off her fingers, and then tell everyone in the village that he discovered she was a werewolf, that he simply carried out justice. Gustav turned automatically to the two men to convey to them my point of view, so I yelled, "No, you idiot! We won't get out of here alive!" He stopped talking, but the two men had roughly guessed what I had said. Damn this body language. I noticed an angry look in Idu's eyes. His filthy hand touched the blade of his dagger hanging from his belt. "Thanks a lot for your keenness on translating," I told Gustav, "but try to change the subject." In his deep voice, Esteban spoke again while Idu gathered up the scroll and returned it to his pocket, giving me a fiery look. Gustav was saying, "A year ago, Stefano succeeded in cutting off a werewolf's leg with his axe, and in the morning, the werewolf's hairy, clawed leg turned into a human leg, and the same day they found the mayor's son with his leg amputated in an accident. Of course, his dad gave the judgment himself." How awful. Until now, no one has been able to identify or wound the new werewolf, Belasco. At this moment, my eyes fell on the prettiest girl I had seen in my life. Words cannot express the effect of her beauty on my soul. I would need a softer, sweeter language to do so, maybe the language of music. Her eyes were black, as were her hair and clothes, and she stood next to Esteban, looking at me sweetly with a fixed gaze that melted my shyness. She said something to Esteban, who responded to her rudely. What a bastard. He said something else to Gustav, who seemed disgusted. Gustav translated, "It's Katarina, the bar owner's daughter. She said she wanted to tell you something, but Esteban silenced her and told her that women should keep quiet when men are speaking." What a beast, I said. And then I thought for a second, getting an idea. "Gustav, tell me, of course there is a place to spend the night in this tavern?" "Of course, like every filthy tavern in the world, there are rooms upstairs." "Well then," I said, "tell the bar owner that we wish to spend the night." "But why?" asked Gustav. "There's another inn and the church and—" "No, I want to stay here tonight." "Did you drool when you saw your first village girl?" "She's not for 1 second," I retorted. "I just want to be next to her tonight, the night of the werewolf." How romantic, how hot-blooded you sons of the Mediterranean are. He then called the bar owner over and told him of my wish. The latter nodded in welcome and gestured for me to follow him up a rickety staircase to the dirtiest room I've ever seen in my life. So miserable, obvious poverty. The bathroom was just as bad, just a rusty bucket next to the bed. "Listen, comrade," Gustav started. "I know what you're going to say. You'll go and sleep at the inn. As for me, I'm staying." "You've met your destiny," he replied as he spat on the floor, which added nothing to this filth. At the door, he turned to ask me one final question. "And translation?" And he shook his head while leaving, saying, "Ah yes, how could I forget? The gesturing and body language." And he closed the door before I could answer his rudeness. I sat on the bed looking at this place in disgust. Am I exhausted to that extent, or did some hidden compulsion make me do what I did? A knock at the door, and my heart jumped into my throat. I imagined her beautiful, cold hand knocking at the door, telling me something in Romanian that would be the death of me. I opened the door anxiously to find the fat bar owner laughing, revealing his ruined teeth with the best smile he could manage. God help me. He handed me a torn towel and a greasy piece of soap, and then bowed to give the impression of excellent service and left. Obviously, he is the one taking care of this room. It was noon. There was no need to waste the day in this pigsty, so I planned to catch up with Gustav in the bar downstairs, to decide what we would do for the rest of the day. Another knock at the door. It must be that bastard bringing me a dead mouse for lunch this time. Going to the door, I opened it to find Katarina. "Tell me, is there anyone so pretty and pure as her?" "I came, say," she was saying. Am I dreaming, or is she speaking English? Very bad English, true, but understandable. "You, with the wolf, scare?" "Me, yes. I don't know why, but I imagined she would understand me better if I spoke in broken English. It is a natural reaction, even in Arabic, when you talk to a foreigner in your own language. The wolf, he is here. Where? I asked. In bar, this. 6. Who is he? Trembling like a leaf, she went on. Me, attacked me. 1 month, in forest. Escape. Me hurt wolf. He hurt in head. What an interesting story. So, the werewolf attacked her last month, and she managed to escape and wound him in his head. So, when the sun rose, someone was wounded in the head, and she knows who. And right now, he is drinking downstairs in the bar. And who is he? I asked her. I do not know, wearing a hat? Yes, hat. Esteban wear, Milo wear, Kuthar wear, George, Stefano. Head. That's normal, kiddo. In this weather, even the devil himself wears a furry hat. No, him. They never take off. No. Did you get that part? It's an important point. It's natural that the shepherds would get drunk and fight, but in the last month, she could not see their bare heads under any circumstances. This shady insistence on keeping their hats on had aroused her suspicions. Quite a smart observation. But one truth cannot be ignored, which is that the girl is crazy. Totally crazy. Help you? Me? She asked. Yes, kiddo, help you, I. But how could I leave my beliefs and my trust in science to follow her fake story about the head wound? A story that would lead to the slaughter of the first unfortunate man who had accidentally hit a window with his head, or had a brick thrown at him by a naughty child. I patted her shoulder to comfort her as I led her to the door. She made the sign of the cross and went out. Going downstairs to the bar, I found Gustav sitting at a table with Esteban. They were completely drunk. I sat down at the table and started checking the men's rough faces while they laughed and joked rudely, annoyingly, punching each other and swearing. One of them is the werewolf, like she said. But which one? What were the names she mentioned? These kinds of names do not stick to the memory. Ah, yes, George, she said. Stefano. Then Kithar? No, Kuthar. And Milo. One left. Esteban. Of course, it's Esteban who sits at the table with us. I looked at him, contemplating his hairy face as he spoke to Gustav. It's totally understandable why the girl would think this man is the werewolf. He needn't have fangs and claws in order to look scary. But how was this werewolf legend born? In one way or another, it's the same melody that repeats itself in the excellent book by R.L. Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. An honorable man who transforms in certain circumstances into a vicious devil. Is it a human philosophy that tells how each one of us has two sides, black and white? Is it a naive attempt to explain cases of schizophrenia, in which a person flips to an opposite nature without an obvious reason? Anyway, the idea is frightening, and I don't deny that for a moment. I think Esteban turning into a mutant wolf in front of me is enough to make me die speechless. It was 5 p.m. now. I drew close to Gustav, whose breath smelled of alcohol, almost killing me. Is there a way to make these men take off their hats? What? I want to see their bare heads. Are you crazy? First you decide to spend the night here, and now you want to see the shepherds' heads? Is it the cold? No, I replied. My brain hasn't frozen. Just do something. Let me think. For example, I prompted, you could ask for another round of drinks and cheers, and ask them to remove their hats for a salute. Are you joking? We're not in a London pub. These guys are not exactly gentlemen. Well then, I said, Let's bring a religious relic or a cross, something sacred to them, to force them to take off their hats in reverence." "They don't even go bareheaded in church itself," Gustav exclaimed. "Well then—" Just then, Gustav stood up shakily, carrying a bottle in one hand, and told me, "There's an easier and more guaranteed way." And he shouted something in Romanian. The loud shouts of surprise rose, and I saw all eyes looking at me with hatred or disgust or doubt. "What did you tell them, you madman?" I demanded. "I told them what you wanted, without beating around the bush. I told them that the man from Egypt wishes, with their permission, to see their bare heads." What a fool! He was drunk, and had put me in a situation which was not only embarrassing, but also a threat to my life. With clenched fists, they all looked at me. Some considered it an insult, and some considered it stupidity, and some considered it just a whim. Only one of them, without a doubt, realized I knew everything. Esteban drew closer to me, giving me a fiery look. He then hit the table with his fist and started shouting. I assumed it was directed at me. "He says," Gustav translated, "that you're a bastard and a nuisance and a son of a—" "I got that part," I said nervously. "And he demands an explanation." I swallowed hard, avoiding looking at the men's fiery gazes. I told Gustav, "Tell him to sit down and you'll explain to him, on the condition that no one hears us." Gustav conveyed my words to him. Esteban stopped for a moment, staring at us with hatred and doubt. Then he made a decision, turning to the men and ordering something. He then pulled up a chair and sat at the table in front of me. And in quick sentences, I conveyed what the girl had told me in my room. I told him that I doubted him and was asking him to reveal the cards before nightfall. Frowning, he took a sip of Gustav's bottle and then wiped his mouth with the back of his hairy hand. He stared at my face for a few moments and then stood up and shouted loudly at the men, "Stefano!" A handsome young man whose head was covered with a dirty bandana approached him. "Kuthar!" A short, fat man left his seat and came over. "Milo Anstat!" Sobering up from his short nap at the bar, Milo came over to us, fixing the fox fur hat on his head. "George!" Suddenly, a young bearded man with a leather hat appeared as Esteban turned to the rest of the men and said something. Tense moments ensued. One of the men closed the door of the bar. The men who had been called over started pushing up their sleeves. Obviously, they understood that he called them over to destroy me. It seemed likely to me, because all of his Romanian words could mean, "This mister says you are werewolves. Come, take your revenge on him." Turning to me, Esteban said something and then directed the men to sit around the table. He began talking in a deep voice, stressing every syllable. Gustav translated. "He's telling them what you said. He's saying you claim the werewolf is one of the 5 sitting at this table, and he's demanding they take their hats off or he'll blow their heads off with his rifle." Slowly, in surrender, the men began removing their hats. Silence filled the place. Dry throats awaiting what would happen. Naked foreheads. Then, in a dramatic way, Esteban reached for his hat, pulled it off, and placed it on the table in front of him. If the girl was lying about the wound, I would be in a very difficult situation here. All of their heads were intact, with the exception of 2. Stefano and Milo Anstat both had wounds. The men shouted violently, while the 2 suspects shouted back with fear in their voices. Of course, each one was explaining where and how they had gotten a cut like this. Esteban spoke again. "This man has a strong character and has influence over these men." Shouts of agreement rose higher as the 2 men grew more miserable. I looked at Gustav. The events had swept him, and he had stopped translating anything to me. Realizing, he told me, "Esteban says the situation is clear, and that we'll sit right here all night until one of the 2 men turns into a werewolf, and that the sky is going to make the decision." "But how to kill the werewolf then?" I asked. "The first sign of turning is the red eyes. and he's going to watch them like a hawk, waiting on the first attempt from one of them, and then will slaughter him with his silver dagger before his transformation is complete. 7. The encounter. The minutes passed slowly, really boring, as we sat at the table surrounding Stefano and Milo Anstadt, their heads bare, crying and shaking. The minutes passed, slowly. Suddenly, someone shouted something, and everyone turned to Milo. "They're saying his eyes have gotten red." True, his eyes were bloodshot, but the redness was in the sclerae, not the pupils. And, of course, that was the result of too much crying and the heat and smoke and the stifling atmosphere. "But it's not in his pupils," I said. "It's the sclerae." "And you expect these shepherds to know the anatomic difference between the pupil and the white part of the eye? It's a red eye, and that's enough." Won over by the ecstasy in the situation, the shepherds shouted enthusiastically, while Milo froze in his seat, seeming panicked, like a mouse who falls into a trap and sees no need in wasting his last moments fighting. I felt creeping nausea as if about to vomit, so I pushed myself towards the door. Gustav called out to me, "What's up, comrade?" "And the werewolf, aren't you holding him here?" I opened the wooden door and went out. The snow and the cold night air. I felt better instantly, but deep inside me there was a feeling of remorse for having caused all this. Maybe my stupidity would lead to a massacre. But it was the only solution I found to save my own life in this bind Gustav's stupidity had caused. And, of course, it was Katarina's stupidity which started this miserable chain of events that would lead to Milo being slaughtered in front of my eyes. From behind the bar window, the men's loud voices reached me. I realized I had to find an escape. But what is it? I couldn't bear seeing a man die simply because of inflammation of the sclera. But how could I prevent it? And here I heard a monstrous growling sound. Lifting my head, I saw the werewolf directly in front of me. Have any of you ever fallen into the grip of a werewolf before? Those who live to tell of the experience can ignore this part. As for the lucky ones to whom this has never happened, for you I say it's a heinous experience. To see in front of you a huge creature wearing human clothing, but his face the face of a giant wolf, and his hands have a wolf's claws, and his voice the growling of a wolf. He stands upright, eyes red as blood, his open mouth revealing white, shiny fangs, and his chest rattles with a hellish growl. This creature is attacking you, so what would you do? Scream? But aren't those the screams of death rather than screams for help? Try to run on the slippery ice, but of course he is faster than you. Try to kick or punch him, but he is solid as a wall. You will fall on the ground in a fetal position, and he will jump on top of you like a nightmare, his claws tearing the flesh of your face. And with diminishing power, you direct a punch to his red eye, so he screams and gets off of you. And in a second, the shepherds surround you, having left the bar upon hearing the fight. And the monster escapes between the snow-covered trees. That's exactly what happened to me. Inside the bar, they sat me down and wiped my face with a wet cloth, and then offered me something in a cup which I drank before asking what it was. Gustav gripped my shoulder tensely and asked me, "What happened?" "Him." "Belasco?" "Yes." "Good heavens," he exclaimed. "Then it's not Milo?" "Did you doubt that?" "Well then, who is he?" "I don't know," I said, "but I gave him a very good punch, almost taking his left eye out." Gustav turned to the shepherds and conveyed my words to them, and signs of salvation showed on the faces of the two accused. All of the men chattered excitedly. Tomorrow, of course, will be a hellish day for anyone who has an injury in his left eye, but still they regarded me with doubtful and violent looks. Esteban pointed at me and said something in doubt. Gustav yelled at him, denying his accusation. I asked Gustav, "What's happening?" "Nothing," he replied. They were thinking of doing away with you now. What? Before you kill their children? Me? How? Next month, he said simply, when you turn into a werewolf. A werewolf? How? He gave me a meaningful look and said in a low voice, "It's the wound. He injured your face in several places. Hadn't you noticed?" Trying to think, I sat in my chair listening to the shouted debate. It's strange that at this same time yesterday I knew nothing about this werewolf story. Isn't it strange that within 24 hours I had delved into this problem to the extent that I myself was on my way to becoming a werewolf? What a turn of events! I knew the story definitely had no chance of being true, and that the thing I encountered outside has a scientific explanation. But the urgent problem now was in facing those rabid idiots who seek blood. With some difficulty, and in spite of his obvious drunken state, Gustav managed to save my life by convincing the shepherds to wait, and to go easy on me, with the assurance that I would be gone from the village next month. Gone from all of Romania, actually. I would be in Egypt, where I would bring this disastrous legend of the Wolfman to the happy Nile Valley, which means Romania would export the werewolf infection to all of Africa. That's enough thrill for one night. Slowly I stood up, and with steady steps I went up the stairs. No one stood in my way. I entered my filthy room, took off my shoes, and lay down on the bed. What a day! What a day! The door opened with a slow squeak. Let that be the werewolf or the devil himself. I won't be able to get up or even resist. If he wants to devour me, let him do so without waking me up. But it was a Katarina's soft voice. "Something you want, mister?" With my eyes closed, I replied, "No, Angel, no, nothing." She went out, closing the door behind her, but she quickly opened it again, peeking her small dark head in, saying, "Thank you. For me, mister." The bed shook under me, but I was tired. Sunlight streamed through the window. I opened my eyes and moved my limbs, feeling strength returning from them after my deep sleep. This sleep had washed me from inside, and now I was clear-headed. I went over to the dirty sink, washed my face, and glanced at the broken mirror. There were 2 long wounds on my left cheek. But I'm a doctor and can't be fooled easily. Who said these wounds were from a werewolf's claws? Behind me, the door opened and I saw the endearing shadow that had infatuated me, a Katarina carrying a tray of food. She placed it on the table behind me and turned to me without lifting her face. "This breakfast your, mister?" Her black hair fell over her forehead. I drew close to her and tilted her chin up with my hand. Smiling in embarrassment, she said, "Please, no, mister, I not..." I pushed the hair off of her forehead. "Ah, that's what I was looking for. And now, my angel, you're in a terrible bind, and you would be naive if you thought bringing your hair down could save you." With careful English, while stressing every syllable, I said, "Katarina, why is there a bruise over your left eye?" 8. Chasing the wolf. In confusion, while bringing her hair back over her eye, she cried, "This door. I hit door." I gripped her wrist tightly and pushed her hair back again. "No, kiddo, I'm the one who hit you last night when you were playing the role of the werewolf. And the night and the horror made me imagine you were unbelievably strong." "I no understand, mister." "No animal's claws could cause these wounds on my face. It's actually from a very small cutting tool you held in your fist to make an effect." Tears filled her eyes and her whole being shook. And here the door opened and I saw her father, the bar owner, entering as suspiciously as the look he gave us. His eyes froze on Katarina's face and especially on her left eye. Then suddenly he seemed to understand. He gestured to her and said something before rushing out of the room while repeating the same sentence over and over. One doesn't have to be very intelligent to understand he was saying, "The werewolf is my daughter. The werewolf is my daughter." I turned to her and exclaimed, "Please, no time to explain. Run now. Escape." "But..." "Escape. Those bastards are bloodthirsty, and your dad will be only too happy to sacrifice you in order to prove his loyalty to the group." "But..." "They won't understand anything about your mental illness," I told her. "They'll throw you on the ground and kill you with the silver blade." "But..." "Come on. Go to Father Antonescu at the church and ask for asylum there. Confess everything to him. As for me, I'll try to fix the situation by explaining to them." And here the voices of the men downstairs rose higher, angry and violent shouts. They were coming because the crazy barman had called them. Quickly and without hesitation, I grabbed Katarina's hand, opened the window despite the snow surrounding it, and gently helped her slide down the thick snow. I gestured for her to run. Hesitating for a moment, she looked at me and then started running. The men entered the room, evil shining in their eyes. In Romanian, they demanded what obviously meant, "Where is she?" I pointed at the window, and they rushed down the stairs to follow her. Esteban, of course, searched the room several times before believing me. Then he gave me a doubtful look and followed the others. I found myself alone in the room, and maybe in the whole bar. Opening the door, I checked the place around me. There were 2 rooms on this floor, the doors of which were shut. Slowly, I walked to the first door, turned the rusty knob, and found myself in a small, relatively clean room. On the bed lay a piece of unfinished knitting, and on a table in the middle of the room, a delicate vase holding withering flowers, the names of which I did not know. Everything points to this being a female's room, Katarina's specifically. Her clothes were thrown carefully on a wooden chair next to the bed, and here a Slovakian poem so foreign that you don't even know if you're holding the paper the right way up. My action was rude and intrusive, but I had to know. Thus, with cold, shaky hands, I lifted and flipped the mattress on the bed, finding a large cloth bag tied carefully. Opening it, I put my hand inside and felt something like fur and other pieces of pointy plastic. Emptying the bag on the bed, I found what I had expected, the werewolf's head that attacked me last night, a carefully crafted mask covered with fur, and the lit red eyes which allow the one wearing the mask to see through them, and the bottom jaw full of movable fangs. A truly artistic piece. Next to the mask were some fur gloves with claws, and then something which resembled a life jacket, something to enlarge the sides of the chest and shoulders when worn under clothing. Then, and most importantly, a meticulous cutting tool and a bunch of various size knives which could slice an elephant's skin. And finally, a photograph of a handsome, clean-shaven guy smiling like an idiot. Now I understand everything. Katarina is Belasco, the werewolf the whole village had been searching for, scaring the villagers to death. She had prepared this realistic costume for herself and started going out on every full moon, looking for the miserable one whose bad luck would place him in her fist. And with all this terror and shock, no one was ready to defend himself. No one even tried to do so. And in the dark, she would cut them with the knives she hid in her costume and then escape, returning to her original role, the bar owner's sweet daughter. And occasionally, she would tell fools like me the story of the werewolf with the wounded head. But why was she doing that? Why? "Dr. Rifat!" It was Gustav's voice calling me. He had just woken up from sleep, having been exhausted from getting drunk the night before. He had looked for me at the bar, finding no trace of me and no one to ask. "Up here, Gustav. I'm up here." He met me on the second floor, where I stood in Katarina's room. And on the bed, he saw the werewolf costume, asking stupidly, "Did you kill it and skin it?" What an idiot. I explained everything to him. "And now what?" he asked. "First, we'll go to the church to confront her with what we know. And then?" Then we'll manage to conceal it or announce it, according to her explanation. She might be a murderess who deserves to be hung, and she might be a schizophrenic who deserves to be treated. But whatever the case, we won't leave the matter to vigilante justice in this village. We have to take her to Bucharest by any means. At the church, we met Father Antonescu. In low tones, I asked about the girl, but he explained that she never came. I swore to him that we would not hurt her, so he became angry, insisting he does not lie. Well then, where did the miserable girl go? Did the shepherds succeed in grabbing her before we managed to? Now we had to search for her. And here I remembered something, so I took out the picture of the handsome young guy from her room, brought it close to the priest's thick glasses. Do you know this young man, Father? The priest gave Gustav no chance to translate as he brought his nose close to the picture and exclaimed, "Ah, Niculescu," and he said a few other words while making the sign of the cross. Gustav explained, "He says his name is Niculescu." "Well, that's clear. I'm not a donkey, you know." "And," said Gustav, "he is the mayor's son. He was a werewolf and attacked Stefano, but Stefano cut off his leg with an axe. And in the morning it was said that the story about his leg being amputated was a silly, made-up tale. Therefore they realized that he is the werewolf, and they killed him. And of course, this kid was in love with Katarina." Through a quick conversation between the two men, I realized that the answer was yes. So that's the story. A tragic love story between two sensitive kids. And the girl loses her lover as the result of a deceiving story by Stefano. Thus, she insisted on taking revenge, turning their moonlit nights into hell, as if saying, "Okay, you wanted a werewolf, you got it." And every month, she would kill one of those responsible for the death of her lover. Then she chose a heinous death for Stefano through me. She knew his head was wounded, so she knew that last night's events would lead him to being killed, just like her lover. And when the winds did not blow her way and Milo almost lost his life, she put on the werewolf costume and waited to attack the first one to leave the bar. And, just my luck, it was me. But what was the explanation for Niculescu losing his leg? He told them he blacked out while walking in the woods at night, and when he woke up, his leg was gone. He found the wound tied up to stop the bleeding. He dragged himself home and threw himself on his bed, blacking out until they woke him up in the morning to accuse him of being a werewolf. A strange story, hard to believe. But if we imagine, with some extension of imagination, that Stefano was also in love with Katarina, we can complete the story. He could have attacked the kid as he walked in the woods, cut off his leg with an axe, and placed a makeshift tourniquet. Then he ran to the village to announce the fake story of the werewolf, and that way he got rid of his competition in a clean way with a group ruling of hanging. But Katarina was there, and she decided to reward the village with a real werewolf. The last question I asked the priest before ending the conversation was, how did the story of the werewolf start in this village? Gustav translated my question, and the priest shook his head wearily and then smiled and began speaking. Gustav translated, "He says this happened centuries ago, in the medieval era. The nobility, specifically the family of Sakharozan, ruled the country by iron and fire. But a curse hit their descendants. Their children were born as werewolves. The first sign of the disease was black-colored urine and abdominal pain. Then they turned into freakish wolves." Black urine and abdominal pain? Freakish wolves? That reminded me of something. Yes, that's it. I explained to Gustav. That's how the story goes. But the truth is that they were sick with a curable disease. In the old days, people called this disease the Wolfman disease. As for the scientific name, it's porphyria. This disease stems from an imbalance of iron in the body. Then a lot of symptoms develop, including abdominal pain, dark urine, and in rare cases, the nails and fangs grow and the skin wrinkles. The eyebrows thicken, and the lips retract and become cracked, and the eyes are red. Then the patient avoids the sun as he can't bear it. In short, said Gustav, they turn into a human wolf. And with time, the myth is born and lives inside the people's consciousness. And some of them use it to kill their wives or their competitors in love. But never on earth was there a werewolf. Amazing, said Gustav. But will you save this scientific lecture until after we save the girl? Oh, God, I totally forgot about her. I was submerged in the ecstasy of finding an explanation for this historical riddle, and for a second I fancied myself a mixture of Sherlock Holmes and Louis Pasteur, and I totally missed that this was not a convenient time. Let's hurry. We thanked Father Antonescu profusely. In the graveyard we found them, blood smears on the white snow, and all of them standing silently, heads bowed. On the snow she lay with her beautiful black hair spread about her amidst the blood-stained snow. And in her chest was a long silver blade half buried. A silver blade, while her murderers stood around her, exhausted and breathing hard. We were too late, much too late. At her feet someone lay over her, washing her with his tears. He was bareheaded, and on his scalp was a long wound. It was Stefano. He had lost his love in front of his own eyes, and he was the one who carried out these atrocities so that she would be his alone. But I don't feel any sympathy for him. Gustav wept silently, and 2 warm tears fell on my own cheeks, quickly turning into snowflakes at the corner of my mouth. Without another word, I took Gustav's arm, and he led me away from this terrible scene. The legend of the werewolf had ended forever. But I'm not at all proud of my role in it. I'm really not proud. And the sun rises silently over the graveyard. 9. The ending. At the airport in Bucharest, I shook Gustav's hand and thanked him for everything. Then I asked him to continue to write to me. He touched the wound on my face and said with a smile, "If you turn into a werewolf next Thursday, don't forget to write me." I did not smile, but said bleakly, "Please, don't ever mention this in your letters." "Oh, sure, let's forget the past." I lit a cigarette and contemplated the passengers lining up at the ticket counter. I asked him, "Did you publish the story?" "No." "And why not? It is thrilling, in spite of everything." "The cultural office within the party," he said, and then looked about him carefully to ensure no one was listening, and went on, "told me that my story is fictional, and backwards, and does not serve the ideology of the party. Plus, it accuses the Southern Shepherds of being idiots." "Maybe it's for the best," I said as I shook his hand for the last time. Then I approached the ticket counter eagerly as he called out, "Try to come back to Romania soon. Amazing things await you in Dr. Frankenstein's castle." "There's no avoiding it," I said, "but I want to learn the Romanian language first." "Farewell, comrade. My greetings to the Sphinx." "Farewell." And my plane took off. I thought I was returning to my calm, sweet world. I didn't know I was about to face a new nightmare in my home village. But that's another story. Signed, Dr. Rifat Ismail, Cairo, 1992.